Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending this afternoon's webinar on social housing, the Green Agenda. So just to introduce, I am Fiona McLeod. I am chairing today's event. I'm a senior associate at Brodie's and I'm an accredited specialist with the Law Society for Housing and Residential Tenancy Law. But you're not here today to listen to me talk. Today we're going to be presented by Chris Dunn, and Chris Dunn leads the Brodie's social housing team. He has extensive experience and knowledge within the social housing sector. Chris is qualified both in England and Scotland and has over 30 years experience across the UK in social housing finance. This includes working on the finance of the earliest stock transfers completed in Scotland, the development of LMA facility documentation specific to the social housing sector, and the first private placement completed in Scotland and the first listed bond transaction completed in Scotland. So Chris' practice covers all types of debt finance, as well as private placement and bond transactions. But today, Chris is going to be talking about a real hot topic in the sector, particularly in relation to social housing finance, and that is the Green Agenda and what we can expect to come over the coming months and years. So Chris, I will hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Good afternoon, everybody. So the Green Agenda, as it relates to social housing, it's obviously very much a hot topic at the moment, particularly with COP26 happening in Glasgow in the autumn. But to put a bit of framework around about this, there's quite a lot of terminology thrown around in relation to green finance generally, and it's worth just at the outset just outlining what some of the terms that people use mean. So reference to a green loan is generally viewed as a loan that's made available exclusively to finance a new or existing eligible green project. So, for example, that might be a loan that's provided to finance a renewable energy project. In contrast, a sustainability linked loan, or an SLL, is a loan that's used to incentivize a borrower to achieve ambitious predetermined sustainability performance objectives. And this is what we're going to concentrate on this afternoon. So these are loans that are commonly provided for business as usual purposes, rather than in relation to specific green projects, but they benefit from having a margin adjustment applied subject to meeting specified environmental, social, and governance targets. So the key terminology there is environmental, social, and governance. So ESG in short. So I'll be suggesting today that this is really a natural fit for social housing providers. We are seeing the ever-increasing rise of the use of SLLs across all industry sectors, but there's a clear natural fit in the context of social housing. So put at its simplest, if we just look at the initials again, you've got E standing for environmental, so that links to the focus on zero carbon as part of the wider climate change agenda. We've got S for social, so that's the core business of housing associations, and G for governance, which underpins the E and the S. So ESG is already very much embedded in the DNA of housing associations, and many of them already have a sustainability strategy embedded in their overall business plan. So sustainability linked finance is really a natural fit in this context. I'd suggest HAs really focus on areas that already can be readily badged as ESG, If you think about it, core business areas include providing affordable housing, supporting tenants into employment, addressing energy efficiency, and tackling things like fuel poverty. These are all readily badged as ESG items. It's also critically reflective of the direction of travel for new debt and investment at the moment. I mentioned COP26, and really with COP26 coming down the road at us, the green agenda is becoming very much front and center for investors and funders. I'd also suggest that your residents are also increasingly placing a stronger focus on ESG related issues. And that I would suggest that's also linked to the wider societal awareness that we've got now of climate change, diversity, gender and health issues. And residents really now expect their housing providers to be on top of all of this. On the flip side, it's also becoming a regulatory issue, and you have regulators, both regulators of investors and lenders, and also regulators of housing providers, pushing carbon zero at the moment and other sustainability issues. And I would suggest that expectation of performance is going to, in the near future, probably move to a requirement of performance. And that's really why HAs need to be very much on top of this. So moving on, there's been very much a recent surge in activity and initiatives. If we step back, the stewardship code that was launched in October 19, that requires pension trustees and asset managers to consider ESG factors across all asset classes when making investor decisions. So everything they're looking at ESG in relation to it. So you can see why this has now morphed into $1 trillion a year business. In the context of social housing, we have the sustainability reporting standard for social housing that was launched in November 2020 by the ESG Social Housing Working Group. And that was a collaboration of housing associations, banks, investors, and other interested parties. And it sets a number of themes and criteria for HAs to report on annually, and I'll come back to that in more detail. So increasingly, we have lenders, investors carrying out due diligence covering ESG issues, as well as the traditional financial, tax, and business issues. And that's not going to change. The importance of making sure ESG is at the heart of everything a housing association does and every decision that it takes is only going to increase going forward. Social Housing Magazine recently reported that there'd been over 3 billion of ESG sustainable finance raised by housing associations since December 2018. I would suggest that that figure is just going to increase more and more. And we're now seeing this embedded into, if not all, a lot of the transactions on which we're working. So if we move back to the sustainability reporting standard for social housing, or the standard, as I'll call it, that's a voluntary disclosure framework for housing providers to report on their ESG performance. But I think I'm right in saying that over 50 housing associations already signed up to it. So it's becoming pretty much moving towards an industry norm in terms of adoption of it. So from the perspective of investors and lenders, and I would suggest housing associations, a standard approach has great benefit as it allows performance to be measured in a transparent and consistent basis. It also allows you to compare between one entity and another, and that allows parties to benchmark a performance, which is really critical for investors, funders, and regulators. So the objectives in developing the standard were threefold. The first was to sustain and increase capital flows into the UK social housing sector against a background of significant change in policy and investment environment. The second was to develop sectors' approaches to measure, manage, and report on ESG factors and impact performance. And the third was to create the basis for the development of ESG reporting standards and disclosure guidelines for the social housing sector. So the ESG reporting framework it splits into 12 themes and 48 criteria. So it sounds quite cumbersome, but when you go through the different themes and criteria, there are very much things that housing associations are already addressing and dealing with. This is just putting some sort of framework around it. And the themes are both qualitative and quantitative. And if I run through them, I think it is important to say what they are. And there's 12. The first is affordability and security. So that's the theme, and the criteria surrounding that include tenant mix, security of tenure, and fuel poverty. Then there's building safety and quality, and that covers criteria such as disclosing gas safety checks, fire risk assessments, and the Decent Home Standard. Then there's resident voice, which looks at board scrutiny, complaint handling, and resident satisfaction. Then there's resident support. So that looks at what support's provided and how successful it is. Then there's placemaking itself, providing examples of placemaking or place shaping work. And then moving on to the environmental elements, there's climate change. So that might be the distribution of EPC ratings and emissions data, climate change mitigation plans, and environmental strategy. There's ecology, so that's managing pollutants and increasing biodiversity. There's resource management, so that's sourcing materials, water management, and waste management. Category a board and trustees, so looking at experience and demographics of the board and the independence of the board. Structure and governance, which is looking at the regulator, code of governance, and risk management. Staff well-being, which is looking at things like additional support, average sick days, and salary information. And lastly, the supply chain, which is seeking to address how you assess social value and environmental impact. So they're the 12 core themes and some examples of the 48 criteria. And I would suggest, the vast majority of housing associations are already looking at these matters, and it's really trying to sort of capture the information in a consistent manner and addressing how this is then reported. So the next thing really today is just to address how does this translate in practice into a finance contract. So what happens in practice is a borrower and a lender, they'll work together to identify and set a number of sustainability performance targets, or SPTs in the jargon. And SPTs can either be internal and bespoke to a borrower's business. They can be external and set against a borrower's ESG performance in relation to its peers. They can be set by reference to the underlying science, or they can be a combination of those other three. So the SPTs, they'll be set against predefined KPIs, known performance indicators, and they'll need to reflect a borrower's overall sustainability strategy. So this all has to link back to the underlying sustainability strategy of the relevant HA, which also underpins its own ultimate business plan. The SPTs need to be realistic, but they also need to be ambitious and subject to appropriate and meaningful review and measurement. And the reason for that is that works to avoid any suggestion of green washing or sustainability washing. So by that, I mean something that leads to a false impression of or providing misleading information on how a business is conducted to make it more environmentally sound. So lenders are increasingly expecting SPTs to be aligned also to the latest loan market or LMA sustainability linked loan principles. Now, these were last published very recently in May 21, and they set out basic market-facing principles intended to create a consistency of approach between lenders and borrowers. So the SPTs, they're generally measured annually, and a borrower generally self-certifies compliance by means of a sustainability performance compliance certificate. So a bit like certifying compliance with financial covenants, there would be a compliance certificate issued annually to report compliance with the sustainability performance targets. There would be an ability for a lender to require independent verification if required of compliance, and that would be done by way of a suitably qualified external consultant focused on the relevant area to which the SPT relates. So it could be an environmental consultant or other expert. The SPTs themselves aren't created in stone. They would generally be subject to review periodically, say every 5 years, to ensure their continuing suitability. So in essence, there's 4 key steps to that process. You've got to select your KPIs, you've got to calibrate your SPTs, you've got to deal with reporting, and you've got to deal with verification of the reporting. So that's generally how it's addressed. But I think probably hopefully of interest is some questions that I put together that HAs might want to look at when considering this, or local authorities or others who are considering entering into some form of sustainability linked finance, whether through an investor or through a loan provider. So I got 9 questions here. So I think the first one a lot of people would ask is the hassle worth it in order to shave off a few basis points from a margin that's being applied? Because generally you see that there might be a saving of 2-3 basis points against what would have been the margin otherwise applicable if there hadn't been any sustainability linked targets set. And that can operate in one of 2 ways. There can either be a margin reduction with a payment back, or there can be a margin increase if targets aren't met. And I think in due course the move will be to increase rather than decrease with an expectation of margins being met. I would say if HAs are asking themselves whether the hassle is worth it just to create a small cost saving, then the HAs are asking themselves the wrong question and are really approaching this in the wrong way. They need to be looking at what they should be doing as part of their overall business in terms of their moral and other obligation to create a more sustainable world for their employees, tenants, and others, and the general environment in which they operate. It is in itself, creating a small saving can be useful and could equate to delivery of some more affordable housing. But I don't think, in my view, that that's what should be driving it for an HA. Really, an HA, I think, in the current world needs to be seeing this as very much something that needs to be embedded in their overall business plan, and they should be looking at this in that context. The second question people ask is this all not just greenwashing? Is it not just that people are being set targets that they can readily meet? So, well, this is just all a bit of a sham so things can be labelled green or sustainable. I think the answer to that one is really just links back to how you set the targets. If you set targets that are automatically going to be met, and there's not any meaningful monitoring, then the answer is going to be yes. But I would suggest that in the wider context, you need to be looking at ambitious targets, not unrealistic targets, but ambitious targets, and you need to have a proper scheme of monitoring or verification to ensure that these targets are being met, and to create some sort of realism. And that will be important for investors and lenders in terms of their own reporting and their own regulatory position. Another question that I've had raised is, are SLL savings true interest savings, or is this just lenders inflating their margins by a little bit to accommodate a wrapper? And again, I think if you're approaching it in that way, you're probably fundamentally not looking at this in the right context. I think you also need to be looking to the future, which is coming down the road very quickly, and potentially seeing that this might not be something where you're going to be saving a margin, but you might be looking at avoiding a penalty if you're not being able to comply with the appropriate targets. More fundamentally, you've got to consider, do SLLs drive your corporate strategy, or does the corporate strategy drive SLLs? And it really needs to be the latter, in my view, that's fundamental here. You're getting the benefit of an SLL, but that is subject to having a suitably underpinned sustainability strategy for your business. We're asked, is the legal drafting complicated, and does that add to the delivery timetable for a transaction? The truth is it can add to a timetable, not so much in terms of the legal drafting, but just in terms of the parties setting and agreeing on suitable targets to be applied, and selecting those targets. I think there's very much a move away from the more simplistic approach of just looking at things like EPC ratings and trying to see things in a more holistic basis, and looking at issues like, addressing bring people into employment, and those sort of wider sustainability issues that are facing many HAs. Often lenders will agree a suitable timetable to develop an appropriate strategy So you're not having to put everything in place on sort of day one and it all being hardwired, but you would agree a strategy to deliver appropriate targets within a suitable period of time. Another question is, how sophisticated does your data capture actually need to be to deliver the reporting requirements? And that, I think, is quite an interesting challenge, in particularly in the context of smaller housing providers who don't necessarily have the resource and sophistication that some of the very large housing providers can, can bring to something of this nature, and don't necessarily have the luxury of having a big team who are just looking at sustainability. There are a lot of now consultants who've come into this sector and can help with data capture. I do think that it's something that all associations really, depending upon their context, need to be looking at, because it's likely that this information and data capture and reporting is going to be required for accounting or other purposes going forward, and therefore there will need to be some investment provided in order to ensure that suitable procedures are put in place to allow for the relevant data capture. Another question I think HAs need to look at themselves is, how do SLLs link to an HA's broader ESG framework? And as I've said earlier, they really need to do so. So you've got the SLL linking into the ESG framework for an HA, and that linking into its overall sustainability strategy, and that in turn linking into its overall business plan. And it's all really one holistic whole, I would suggest, and it all needs to link together. One for the finance guys who are sometimes approached with terms and SLS related products is, how do you get your colleagues outside treasury or finance on board? I think in this regard, it comes back to just addressing where does an HA sit in terms of society, and in terms of its broader commitments and obligations in relation to ESG related issues. I also think it helps to have a really somebody who's championing this sort of issue within an organization. I think that is often really helpful to push things forward. So in summary, having said all this about sustainability linked finance, I actually think there's no such thing as sustainability linked finance. The reality is it's just finance. It's already morphed into just a standard expectation in many financing models. And I think we need to all just be getting used to this. This is the world in which we're living, and I think this is what we'll find will become very much more of a norm going forward. It's definitely coming down the road at us at an ever increasing pace. And in my view, I'd suggest it's very much better to be an early adopter and ahead of the curve on this. The investment's going to be needed at some point for HAs and others, and I think it's going to be easier to make that investment at an earlier stage rather than trying to catch up at a later point, when this is maybe more of a requirement model from a regulatory or other perspective. I'd also think, without trying to bang a drum on this, there's also a moral imperative behind all this. Reality is, I think we only have one planet, one lot of people living it, and I think HAs in particular, as businesses that are very much focused on the communities in which they work, should be taking a lead role on this. It's not the reason HOs should be doing this, but I think the regulatory field here is going to tighten up, and I think in the next short period of time we'll see much more of a regulatory control on a lot of these points. I also think for in terms of pure monetary reasons, I don't think HA should be looking at taking out SLLs to try to achieve a margin reduction. I think they should be organizing their businesses in order to avoid going forward looking at a margin increase as investors and lenders are pressed in terms of their own reporting to ensure that they are only investing into businesses that have suitable ESG targets. But I think that's enough of me rattling on. I'm not sure, Fiona, if we've had any questions, but happy to try to identify anything.
That was great. Thank you, Chris. Really interesting. We have got some questions, so I will just launch straight into them. So we have a question from the audience saying, do you think there is an issue with a lack of recognised market standard accreditation for the verifiers and consultants?
Yes, I think that is. I think in the way of many things of this nature, it will take some time to get some sort of consistency of approach settled, and you are having you do see quite a lot of different bodies currently certifying or providing accreditations to HAs and other businesses in relation to ESG performance. I think that will settle down over time. I think the initiatives that have been taken forward in relation to the social housing reporting framework and also through things like the LMA have really helped. And I think overall we'll see the position improve. But there is a risk initially that there will be accreditation provided by some bodies that that will need to be revisited at a later stage. But I think that's just the nature of what's quite a fast-moving development. I mean, if you look back, you've seen a huge leap in activity in this area in the last sort of 18, 24 months only. And I think that's quite a short period of time. So you are looking at something that's going to develop at pace over the next few years, I think, really.
Sorry, and just unmute myself. And just to follow up on that then, Chris, do you think that development has been accelerated, or has it been slowed down by COVID and the pandemic?
Well,
unaffected?
as I said, I think there's an I just and I might be wrong here. I just think there's an underlying feeling that COVID has actually pushed forward some of the thinking around about these areas, and I think you can't really look at ESG related issues without also looking at the other sort of issues that have come to the fore in the last few years. And it can be, if we look, I think people are just more conscious of these sorts of issues. So we've had a focus on Black Lives Matters, gender equality, diversity issues, mental well-being issues. To my mind, this just shows that there's a wider focus in terms of what people are interested in. If we consider it from perspective of say my own sort of employees within Brody's, and if we consider what people look for in terms of say a pension nowadays, they are much more focused on things like ESG related issues, and that then feeds into what investors will be looking for in themselves, where they're looking to put their money, which then feeds into what lenders are doing. So I think COVID has really sort of in some ways been useful in pushing forward some of this agenda. I think the other thing in relation to COVID is as well, if you're looking at a sustainability linked target, and then the matters associated with the COVID and addressing COVID-related issues could well fit quite well into some of the ESG framework targets. So at the current time, that might be something if somebody's thinking of taking out an SLL right at the moment, that they might want to see if it could be factored in.
Okay. And one final question, and need to be careful not to breach any confidentiality. Where are we in Scotland with the ESG finance for social housing providers?
Well, we're slightly behind the track compared to England in relation to what's happened with some of the largest housing providers in England, who've been slightly ahead of the game here. But we have already had undertaken a number of transactions, slightly more simplified ones than I think we'll see going forward, and focused on things like EPC rating improvement, etc. But yeah, this is an area where there has been activity. We've already acted in things like funding developments that have been large developments that have been purely financed through the use of renewable energy, which wouldn't and therefore created a margin benefit to the parties involved, and we are seeing it in numerous deals that are currently ongoing that do now have a sustainability linked element to them. So I think at the moment we're certainly catching up quickly, and I think we'll see over the next few months, well, just from my knowledge of things we're working on, we're going to see quite a lot of announcements and quite a lot more activity in this area.
Okay, and I think we've got time for one more question. So this question is following on from yesterday's intriguing and interesting Brodie's seminar with Alison Rose, CEO of NatWest, and Andrew Cave, Head of Governance at Baillie Gifford Asset Management, which looks specifically at financing the transition to net zero. Will ESG funding be made available and affordable as dwindling public sector finances face efficiency saving constraints year on year? And I promise Chris is going to answer this question, not my dog that is currently barking in the background. So I'm going to put myself on mute.
We've already seen announcements from the likes of NatWest, committing very large amounts of money into the sector, and linking that to ESG related performance. So, in my view, this is where there's going to be a wall of investment and money available. There's a lot of investors who are looking to invest now where there is an ESG framework available, and I think you'll see a lot of that a lot going forward. The challenge will be to get, I think, will be to get finance in relation to things that don't tick an ESG box. If you go back 10, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, you were getting funding to do open cast mining, etc. I would suggest now you really struggle to get that funding, but you will get funding, and with more of a demand from investors that are looking for something that they can badge as being green. So yeah, it's whether that will bridge gaps in terms of what government support can be afforded in the current climate. I'm not sure, but I do think that that this will become, as I said earlier, pretty much the norm, that in terms of finance being provided with expectation of ESG related performance and improvement for businesses.
Okay, excellent. I'm conscious of time, so I think we'll leave it there for this afternoon. Please feel free to follow up with Chris or your usual Brody's contact if you have any further questions that are arising from this webinar. As I mentioned, the recording will be sent out to those that signed up for the webinar, along with a briefing note from Chris. So please feel free to review and forward on to any colleagues that you think may be interested. The only thing that's left for me to say is we've got one more seminar in our spring summer series of social housing webinars, and that is coming up at the end of the month. And that is on fraud in the social housing sector, which is another quite relevant topic just now. There seems to be a lot of that in the press articles that are coming through in the usual circulation. So if you can, please feel free to join us to that. That's also another free webinar, and it's on a Wednesday afternoon at the end of the month. And other than that, just to say thank you very much for joining with us today, and we hope to see you all very soon.